Welcome to the Marshall House. It was the home of George Catlett Marshall, who was Army Chief of Staff during World War II, Special Envoy to China, Secretary of State, President of the American Red Cross, and Secretary of Defense. He is best known for the Marshall Plan, a $13 billion American effort to restore the economies of war-torn Europe after World War II. George Marshall and his second wife, Katherine, bought this house in 1941 and lived here until his death in 1959. The house was restored in 2005 to the way it was when the Marshalls lived here in the 1950s. Approximately 90% of the items in the house were owned by the Marshalls. Many of them are associated with Marshall's unique role as a military leader and diplomat, and one of the most important figures of the 20th century. I'm Tom Bowers, and I'll be your host on this tour of the Marshall House. But it's only by visiting the house in person that you can get a true sense of this important house and the American patriot who lived here. The Marshalls did not spend a lot of time in the living room, but it was a place where they could display items and treasures that were meaningful to them. The wallpaper on that wall was original to the Marshalls. On the other walls is the reproduction. Like much of the furniture in the house, this furniture was purchased secondhand and recovered. These items happen to have come from Katherine's sister. The wooden chest and the wooden screen came from China. The painting above that chest was painted by Madame Chiang Kai-shek and given as a gift to the Marshalls. The print above that chest was a gift from Madame Chiang Kai-shek to Katherine Marshall on her 64th birthday. The painting above the fireplace was a gift to Marshall from the government of the Soviet Union in recognition of his role as an ally in World War II. It was painted by a Russian artist named Vasily Bakshayev, and it's entitled Evening. This is a reproduction. The original is owned by one of the grandchildren. The photograph on the table is General John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, who was commander of American Army forces in France in World War I. Marshall served on his staff and later served as his personal aide at a time when Pershing was Army Chief of Staff. The two remained close, and Pershing served as Marshall's best man at his second wedding in 1930. That is a painting done by Winston Churchill and given to the Marshalls as a gift. Churchill painted that scene in Morocco, where he often went to paint. This is a reproduction. The original was sold at an auction to an anonymous buyer for $1.6 million. At the time, the highest price ever paid for a Churchill painting. On this wall is a photograph of King Albert I of Belgium. He was King of Belgium during World War I and was known as the Warrior King. Marshall met him while Marshall was on Pershing's staff. The photograph on the desk is Marshall with Field Marshal Sir John Dill. He was the chief liaison officer for the British Army during World War II and was here in Washington. He and Marshall interacted on an almost daily basis, and they had enormous respect and admiration for each other. Dill had told his wife that he considered this American assignment as the most meaningful of his entire career, and that if he were to die in the United States, he hoped that he could be buried here. He did die in Washington in 1944, and Marshall was instrumental in arranging to have him buried at Arlington Cemetery. Of the approximately 400,000 graves at Arlington, Dill's is one of approximately 30 non-Americans. Marshall also arranged to have an equestrian statue placed at Dill's gravesite, one of only two at Arlington. The other is General Phil Kearny, of the Union Army of the American Civil War. The photograph on the desk was taken in June 1952, and it shows President Harry Truman and his daughter with the Marshalls and some family members. The Trumans came out here to visit and had lunch with the Marshalls. The photograph on that wall is General Robert E. Lee. Marshall had two heroes, men that he modeled his life after, Robert E. Lee and George Washington. He respected them for their sense of duty, honor, and integrity. Now we're in the kitchen, and although Katherine Marshall enjoyed cooking, most of the work in here was done by live-in servants. A couple of the appliances, such as the refrigerator and the dishwasher, are modern reproductions of the appliances that were here when the Marshalls were here. The items on top of the stove belonged to the Marshalls, but those on top of the shelf were donated by Leesburg residents. And now we'll go outside. This property includes almost 4 acres. It was enough space for several fruit trees, flower beds, and a large garden. The Marshalls enjoyed working outdoors, in the flower beds, and in this vegetable garden, where General Marshall grew potatoes, tomatoes, asparagus, and even beets that no one seemed to eat. Occasionally, he was able to persuade a colleague to help him in the garden, including General Hap Arnold, Chief of Staff of the Army Air Forces. Millions of people had victory gardens in World War II. For General Marshall, this was much more than a victory garden. This was a therapy garden, a place where he could escape the pressures of his job. He could come out, he could dig in the soil, plant new seeds, and pull out weeds that threatened his garden. The Marshalls enjoyed being outside for relaxation or even occasionally for an important meeting. President Harry Truman came here on July 4th, 1950 to ask Marshall to become his Secretary of Defense. And Marshall later described that meeting. "The President sat under my oak trees," he said, "and told me his difficulties, and he had me at a disadvantage." This stone court was the only architectural change the Marshalls made. They enjoyed coffee in the morning, occasional lunches, or a cool drink in the afternoon when they had finished working in the garden. And this is the breakfast room. George and Katherine Marshall usually had breakfast in their bedrooms, but this room was used for other meals and by other members of the household. The table and chairs belonged to the Marshalls, as did these items, which came from China. We believe they were purchased by George Marshall and his first wife, Lily, when they were there in the 1920s. The smaller box is a Chinese bride's jewelry box. This was the wallpaper the Marshalls put up, and this was the reproduction. There's some earlier wallpaper patterns in this room that are also interesting. Below the window, you can see 3 different wallpaper patterns. This was the Marshalls wallpaper. The Fighting Roosters were 1 layer below that, and even below that was this 3rd pattern that you could see along here. If the walls in this dining room could talk, They could tell us many stories about the world and national leaders who sat around this table with the Marshalls. Field Marshal Sir John Dill, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, President Harry Truman, his daughter Margaret, Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman, and many more. Even when the Marshalls dined alone or with family members, they did so with a certain degree of formality and were served. This wooden screen from China would have been placed in front of the door to block out any noise coming from the kitchen. The furniture in the room all belonged to the Marshalls. Katherine Marshall loved to go shopping at used furniture stores and auctions, and she bought this Duncan Phyfe reproduction for $40. This portrait of George Marshall was painted by J. Anthony Wills, an artist whose portraits of Presidents Eisenhower and Nixon hang in the White House. On the opposite wall is a portrait of Katherine Marshall painted by the same artist. In it, she is wearing a dress that she got from Madam Chiang Kai-shek. This hallway and the one above it were added to the house in the 1850s. This was the original part of the house, dating from the early 1800s, and you can see one of the exterior windows from that house. The living room and dining room area was added in the 1820s, and the kitchen and breakfast room in the 1850s. This was the Marshalls' telephone. Their number was Leesburg 1301. And this was a portrait of Allen Tupper Brown, George Marshall's stepson. He was 12 years old when his mother married George Marshall, and Allen liked to brag that he was one of the few people allowed to call George Marshall by his first name. Allen, his brother Clifton, and their brother-in-law, James Wynn, all served in the Army in World War II. Tragically, Allen was killed in May of 1944 at the Battle of Anzio in Italy and is buried at the American Military Cemetery there. His mother was able to visit his grave after the war. George Marshall used this small room as a private office. As a permanent five-star general after 1946, he had an office at the Pentagon and a secretary to help him with his correspondence. When he did receive letters here, Sergeant Hefner, his orderly, would open the letters and put them on General Marshall's desk. These shelves contain some memorabilia from Marshall's career, including a World War II helmet, some photographs of wartime conferences that show General Marshall with world leaders such as President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. This is a print made from a painting by President Eisenhower in 1959. The Eisenhowers sent it as a special gift to their friends. George Marshall had died in October 1959, so this came to Katherine Marshall with a note. Dear Mrs. Marshall, with best Christmas wishes, Mamie and Dwight Eisenhower. The Marshalls used this Eastman Kodak box camera to take many photographs. General Marshall built this cabinet and put broom handles in as pegs for his many hats. And this is one of his many canes and walking sticks. This library was the Marshalls' favorite room, and this is where they spent most of their time. The furniture, which they purchased used, has been recovered, but the curtains are original to the Marshalls. This is a photograph of General Marshall with Lord Louis Mountbatten of the British Navy and an important Allied leader in World War II. The red leather chair was General Marshall's favorite, and it was positioned close to the General Electric radio and television set that was considered state-of-the-art in the 1950s. George and Katherine Marshall enjoyed watching I Love Lucy and Gunsmoke, and their granddaughter remembers seeing him watching American Bandstand. General Marshall's books are on the shelves in the same position they were when he was here. Marshall's favorites were military histories, biographies, and westerns. That's the official coronation photograph of Queen Elizabeth II from 1953. George Marshall represented the American people at the coronation. When he walked into the coronation, the British citizens recognized him and stood and applauded. It wasn't until later that he realized that they were applauding for him. The picture on the wall is another of Robert E. Lee. These are pictures of people who were important to George Marshall, beginning with his mother, Laura Bradford Marshall. And here is Marshall with his teammates on the VMI football team. Queen Frederica of Greece and her family, President Harry Truman, General Marshall riding in a Jeep in Italy in 1944 with General Mark Clark, and Madame Chiang Kai-shek and her husband, the Generalissimo. George and Katherine Marshall had separate bedrooms. This was his, and hers was on the other side of that bathroom. One of the reasons for their separate bedrooms was their different morning routines. He awoke early and went out to work in his garden or left for his office in Washington, D.C. Katherine, on the other hand, slept later and stayed in her room in the morning. Sergeant Hefner, Marshall's orderly, brought breakfast to him every morning, and it would have been awkward if George and Katherine were sharing the same bedroom. This was General Marshall's simple bed and another picture of George Washington. The rugs came from China. We're not sure if they came back with George and his first wife Lily in the 1920s or George and Katherine in 1946. We do know that the Chinese characters are pronounced Ma She Le, which is the Chinese transliteration for Marshall. Here we have some of General Marshall's military gear, a fishing pole, part of a dress uniform, and a picture of Robert E. Lee. These are General Marshall's clothes in the closet, including his riding boots. For Marshall, horseback riding was a lot like gardening. It was a chance to get away from the pressures of his job. When he was at Fort Myer, he went horseback riding almost every day. This was Katherine Marshall's bedroom. She was a graduate of Hollins College and aspired to be a stage actress. Her father was opposed to the idea, however, but he allowed her to go to England to study theater. She did more than study theater. She joined a professional Shakespearean company and performed on stage. She returned to the United States after a couple of years and married Clifton Brown, an attorney, and they settled in Baltimore. Unfortunately, Clifton Brown was shot and killed by a client. A couple of years later, Katherine Marshall was in Columbus, Georgia, and met a young officer from nearby Fort Benning named George Marshall. And they were married in 1930. On the desk behind me are pictures of Katherine's son, Alan. The photograph on the right was used for the portrait of him that is downstairs. The dress on the bed was made from silk that Katherine received from Madame Chiang Kai-shek. While they were looking for a house, Katherine Marshall saw this sign in the yard and stopped to take a look. She decided it was exactly what they were looking for, and she had $10 in her pocket that she used for earnest money. Before she left, she pulled the sign out of the ground and threw it under some bushes so that nobody else could see that the house was for sale. This bright and airy room was the guest room while the Marshalls lived here. The most famous person to stay here was Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who visited on 2 occasions. The Marshalls' wallpaper was removed at the time of the restoration of the house. New wallpaper was put up in 2013. Jim Wynn, one of the Marshalls' grandchildren who had spent time here as a boy, was asked to recall what the wallpaper looked like. This was his memory of the upper part of the wall, and that was the lower part. Based on those 2 watercolors, a wallpaper expert determined that this was probably the pattern that was here when the Marshalls were here, and it was used to make enough to paper the entire room. Over here are 2 pictures of Katherine Marshall. This one shows her in her later years, and this shows a much younger Katherine Marshall holding this feather. As we come down the stairs, we can see these paintings of the St. Albans Grand Steeplechase in England. They were a gift to General Marshall from Bernard Baruch, the powerful financier who was an advisor to President Franklin Roosevelt. Marshall cultivated his friendship with Baruch as he dealt with both Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. To my left is a painting of fish. It was a gift to Marshall from the Chinese Cultural Enterprise Company in 1946. The koi are considered symbols of good luck, as is the number of fish in the painting, 9. George Marshall was one of the most important figures in American history. President Harry Truman said he was the greatest military mind the United States ever produced. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called him the organizer of the Allied victory in World War II. The Nobel Committee lauded him for his efforts toward world peace. Although he was born in Pennsylvania, George Marshall chose this house in Leesburg, Virginia, as his home and haven. It was here that he came to rest and relax and to work in his beloved garden. World and national leaders sought his wise counsel and advice within these walls and under the magnificent oak trees. I hope this visit to the Marshall House has given you a better appreciation for this humble and patriotic man who answered his country's many calls to duty.